I'm honored to serve as the respondent and moderator for today's keynote lecture. Let me first introduce our keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Debra Mumford. Dr. Mumford is the Dean and Frank H. Caldwell Professor of Homiletics at Louisville Seminary. She is also an ordained minister in the American Baptist churches in the state and an affiliated minister with the Alliance of Baptists. Before her call to ministry, Dr. Mumford excelled as a mechanical engineer after graduating from Howard University. Her pastoral and administrative roles in diverse congregations around the San Francisco Bay Area have grounded her insights into the practical aspects of ministry. Her scholarly interests include African-American prophetic preaching, prosperity preaching, eschatology and reign of God, and preaching and health. Since 2008, she has served as a mentor for the Louisville Youth Group, a grassroots organization that provides resources and a safe space for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, and questioning young people ages 14 to 20. Today, her lecture topic is From Stigma to Acceptance, Preaching Mental Health Well-Being in the Church and Beyond. So let us warmly welcome Reverend Dr. Debra Mumford.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. I would like to thank your principal, Dr. Hiron Kim Craig, for the invitation to share with you in this Rethinking Preaching Conference. It is my honor and privilege to be with you today. And I am grateful to Wingy Wong for her facilitation of this session and for her response as well. So I would like to start this lecture with a question. How many of us have ever heard a sermon advocating for justice and creating a better understanding of people with mental illness? I dare say not many of us have, and that needs to change. Just to be clear, the goal of preaching about mental illness is not just to share information, rather our goal is threefold: to highlight the sheer scale of those impacted by mental illness. 2, to remind us that people with mental illness, like all of us, are beloved children of God. And 3, to suggest strategies for developing sermons with mental illness. Now, even before we share just the scale of those impacted by mental illness, let's make sure we're on the same page by defining mental illness and mental health. The American Psychiatric Association defines mental illness this way: mental illnesses are health conditions involving changes in emotion, thinking, or behavior. Mental illnesses can be associated with distress and/or problems functioning in social, work, and family activities. Let's also define mental health. According to the World Health Organization, mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, to realize their abilities, to learn well, work well, and contribute to their community. It is an integral component of health and well-being that underpins our individual and collective abilities to make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world in which we live. Mental health is a basic human right, and it is crucial to personal, community, and socioeconomic development. So while we talk about mental illness, ultimately, we all would like for everyone to have a wonderful state of mental health, to be as mentally healthy as possible. So now let us talk about the sheer scale of those impacted by mental illness. In 2019, 1 in every 8 people, or 970 million people around the world, were living with a mental disorder. with anxiety and depressive disorders being the most common. There are more than 200 types of mental health disorders, including anxiety disorders, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, and other mood disorders, disruptive behavior disorders such as oppositional defiant disorders and conduct disorder, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, better known as OCD, personality disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and schizophrenia, just to name a few. In 2020, the number of people living with anxiety and depressive disorders rose significantly because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Initial estimates show that a 26 to 28% increase respectively for anxiety and major depressive disorders in just 1 year. While effective prevention and treatment options exist, most people with mental disorders do not have access to effective care. The Center for Addiction and Mental Health is Canada's largest mental health teaching hospital. They share the following statistics. Only half of Canadians experiencing a major depressive episode receive potentially adequate care. 1/3 of Canadians aged 15 or older who report having a need for mental health care say those needs are not being fully met. 75% of children with mental disorders do not have access to specialized treatment services. And Aboriginal youth are about 5 to 6 times more likely to die of suicide than non-Aboriginal youth. In order for us to preach about mental health and mental illness effectively, it will also be helpful for us to understand that mental illnesses are caused by 3 primary factors: genetic, environmental, and social factors. And these 3 factors often converge to create very poor mental health outcomes. Disorders such as autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, bipolar disorder, major depression, and schizophrenia can be genetic. In a study conducted in 2013, in which the potential for genetic roots was discovered, scientists found genetic glitches that may lead to more effective treatments for mental illness. Having relatives with mental illness does not necessarily mean that those related to them will have the illness as well. However, it does increase one's risk for mental illness. While some mental illnesses can be genetic, others can be caused by the environments in which we live. Some environmental factors include environmental pathogens, environmental destruction, and environmental form. Now, by pathogens, I mean that they are parasites that have the ability to attack, live in, and reproduce in human bodies. The novel coronavirus is an example of an environmental pathogen that has impacted the mental health of millions of people around the world. Environmental destruction can be experienced in many different forms, including catastrophic and traumatic events such as hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, earthquakes, and fires. These types of events happen quickly, but can radically change the life trajectories of those affected through the sudden loss of loved ones, property, and/or physical health. These events cause psychological distress, depression, and anxiety. The term environmental form refers to the built, social, cultural, and political environment in which people live. Environmental form includes the social conditions created by public policies, such as redlining, racial discrimination, and the systematic denial of goods and services to particular populations. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the housing and income instability experienced by many communities led to a prevalence of mental health conditions such as depression and anxiety. Disparities in mental health should not exist. Health disparities that existed before the COVID-19 pandemic made people already on the margins of society because of race, gender, class, gender identity, etc., even more vulnerable to the virus and therefore more vulnerable to mental health or mental illnesses. So we must preach about mental health and mental illnesses because every human being has the right to live in a world with the social, economic, and political infrastructure to support their mental health well-being. Now, despite the fact that scientists and mental health professionals have identified many of the genetic, environmental, and social factors that contribute to mental illness, people with mental illness still experience stigma in our world. According to the American Psychological Association, stigma, as it relates to mental health, is defined as prejudice against people with mental illness. Mental health stigma has three primary manifestations: public stigma, self-stigma, and institutional stigma. Public stigma relates to the negative attitudes and biases people have about mental illness. Self-stigma is defined as negative attitudes people internalize about mental illness, and institutional stigma refers to systemic laws, structures, and policies of the government and other organizations that discriminate against people with mental illness. Now, some prejudice against people with mental illnesses stems from lack of understanding and fear. In Greco-Roman society, a stigma was a physical brand used to mark people as slaves or criminals. For hundreds of years, people who suffered from illnesses such as depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, and autism were treated like criminals. In some cultures, people with mental illnesses were believed to be possessed by demons and were burned at the stake or institutionalized in asylums and madhouses or chained to their beds. Today, mental health continues to be stigmatized in many of our societies and cultures. In her book, Troubled Minds, Amy Simpson highlights that many manifestations of mental health stigma are regularly employed in the media. For example, people with mental illnesses are portrayed in movies such as Psycho, Strange Brew, The Shining, and Fatal Attraction as terrorists or made fun of to generate cheap laughs. In ordinary conversation, the terms crazy and psycho are sometimes used to characterize behavior that is not quote unquote normal, or that may tend towards violence and disruption. However, over the past few years, including during the height of the COVID pandemic, public awareness of the need for mental health has increased. Having celebrities such as Simone, Biles, and so many others publicly share their mental health struggles has gone a long way to mitigate the stigma of mental health. Decorated gymnast Simone Biles was lauded by some and criticized by others when she withdrew from the women's gymnastic final in the 2020 Tokyo Olympic Games, citing concerns about her mental health. Biles has won 7 Olympic medals, 4 of which are gold. While performing her Aminar vault, Biles landed very awkwardly, and the crowd gasped when they witnessed this very uncharacteristic faltering in her performance. After withdrawing, Biles told reporters, "I have to focus on my mental health and not jeopardize my physical health and well-being. She went on to say that it really, she said, quote, unquote, she said, quote, "It just sucks when you're fighting with your own head," unquote. While gymnastics is a physical sport, being mentally unhealthy can put one's physical health in jeopardy. Years before the Tokyo Olympics, Biles publicly discussed her ongoing struggles with anxiety and panic attacks. However, though some progress has been made with public celebrities sharing their struggles, much more work needs to be done to counter the stigma of mental illness. And some of that work needs to be done inside communities of faith. People of faith sometimes bring their lack of understanding and fear of people with mental illness with them to church. Unfortunately, most do not receive any teachings or preaching to inspire them to reconsider their thinking on the matter. Mental health stigma within the church can be exacerbated or caused by contextually unsound approaches to biblical interpretation and preaching. Even in the 21st century, some preachers teach their people to ignore medical science and medical advances. Rather, they teach that the only way God heals is through miraculous intervention, and that the cause of all disease and illness is sin. In some congregations, people with mental illness are likened to the Gerasene man possessed by demons that we find in the Gospels, such as Mark 5, Luke 8, and Matthew 8. In these texts, a man who is possessed by demons spends his days and nights howling and injuring himself with stones. No one knows what to do with him, and he continually breaks chains that are put upon him by those who try to restrain him. However, when he has an encounter with Jesus, his destiny changes. At once, Jesus determines the man to be possessed by an unclean spirit. Jesus commands the unclean spirit to leave him, and he is immediately restored to his right mind, so to speak. Fear of people who are not in their right minds has been pervasive in communities from antiquity to today, whereas people in the first century labeled this man as demon-possessed. Mental health professionals today are able to diagnose people exhibiting similar symptoms and to prescribe therapies and medicines to help them live productive lives. So for us to categorize all people with mental illnesses as people who are out of control or who can potentially do harm to others or themselves is a misinformed understanding. So throughout human history, people with disabilities have been marginalized and discriminated against both inside and outside of religious communities. So in order for us to develop an approach to preaching about mental health, we will engage the work of two theologians, Nancy Easlin and John Swinton, and one homiletician, Kathy Black. I will give an overview of their contributions and then share approaches to preaching that reflect each of their contributions. Nancy Easlin was a theologian who began her activism work in high school and continued while in college and through her PhD work at Emory University. She died of genetic lung cancer in 2009. Through her research and theological writing, Easlin sought to help people with disabilities fully integrate into the life of the church. Though her writings primarily focused on people with physical disabilities, her work is very relevant to people with mental disabilities as well. Easlin reminded her readers that while the minority group designated people with disabilities has many similarities to other minority groups, it also has a particular uniqueness. People with disabilities encompass those with a wide range of physical, psychological, intellectual, and functional impairments such as deafness, paralysis, dyslexia, multiple sclerosis, and mental retardation. The disabilities can be static or progressive, congenital, or acquired. Though each of these disabilities is different, they result in the same type of stigma throughout wider society. The minority group of people with disabilities is also unique because unlike other minority groups of people designated by race, gender, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, membership in this group can be achieved by anyone. All currently non-disabled people have a 50% chance of becoming permanently or temporarily disabled in their lifetime. And this also certainly applies to mental health issues. People can become impaired or disabled through illnesses, accidents, or genetic conditions. The probability of becoming disabled increases with age. Racial minorities, the elderly, and people living in poverty or in rural areas have a higher probability of becoming disabled than others. John Swinton is a professor of pastoral care and practical theology at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and is a consulting professor at Duke Divinity School. He worked for many years as a community health chaplain. Swinton's first recommendation for preaching or developing or interpreting the Bible for people with mental illness in mind is to interpret using their lived realities and experiences. Use their stories when we are preaching as we are given permission. This requires biblical interpreters to transcend their ableist interpretive biases in favor of perspectives that include issues of people with many different and diverse mental disabilities. Swinton contends that interpreting the Bible with the experiences of people with mental health challenges in mind creates a hermeneutic that is contextual, critical, prophetic, and faithful. The hermeneutic is contextual because it takes into account the lived experiences of people with disabilities. It is critical because it challenges interpretations that misrepresent mental illnesses. It is prophetic because it attempts to disrupt assumptions and overcome cultural distortions to include those who are victimized by systems and structures. And the hermeneutic is faithful because of its commitment to provide fresh and new ways of being representatives of Christ in the world. Our last theologian is Kathy Black. Black is an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church and professor of homiletics and liturgics. In her seminal work, A Healing Homiletic, Preaching and Disability, Kathy Black analyzes a series of healing narratives and biblical texts from the perspectives of people with disabilities. Her goal in this work is to develop a hermeneutic to equip preachers to preach disability-related sermons. So she used 5 different biblical texts to develop her hermeneutic. And the chapter in which Black interprets Luke 8 was dedicated to mental illness. One interpretation of this text, that the healing demonstrates Jesus's power over evil, was problematic for Black. The problem that she finds with this interpretation is that equating mental illness with evil completely discounts the many causes of mental illness identified by mental health physicians and practitioners today. For example, mental illnesses such as post-traumatic stress disorder are caused by witnessing violent acts, some of which can be labeled as evil. Another traditional interpretation focuses on the need for demons to be exorcised or for people to be rescued from the bondage of sin. In response, Black contends that demon possession in the New Testament is not related to personal sin. Instead, demon possession is a random act of evil spirits. The research and writings of Eastland, Swinton, and Black provides guidance for preachers who are committed to preaching about mental health and mental illnesses. God desires for all of God's people to be whole, to experience well-being of mind, body, and spirit. So here are some approaches or some things to keep in mind as we are developing sermons about mental illness. First, just a few facts that should be included in our sermons when we're preaching about mental illness. Being healed or experiencing wholeness does not necessarily equate to being cured. And very often people think that being cured and being healed are the same thing. Being healed can mean that if a person was once ostracized by their community just for being different, they are now accepted into their community as being one and are being given the care that they need. So that they are not necessarily cured, but they are healed of being apart from their community. Mental illnesses, another point is that mental illnesses are caused, we should let everybody know, by genetic, environmental, and social factors. People are connected to one another through physical impairment and physical and mental disability rather than in spite of those conditions. The care needed for some people with mental disabilities represents human interdependence. In our society, we advocate for people to be independent, but we are really, as humans, interdependent, and having a disability, a mental disability, highlights the need for human interdependence. Needing care does not indicate weakness or failure. It just shows that we are human. Another point is that mental disabilities are often hidden. There are people in our congregations who are suffering in silence rather than openly acknowledging their mental illness so that they can avoid social stigma. So the hope is that by preaching about mental illness openly, that people feel much more empowered and free to share their struggles with others in their community. So there are a few theological assertions that preachers should keep in mind when developing sermons. One, while cure means the elimination of at least some of the symptoms of disease, healing occurs when the community, and this is what I was saying a little bit earlier, but participates with God in offering possibilities of well-being with one another. So healing occurs when the community participates with God in offering possibilities of well-being to one another. Another assertion, theological assertion, is that when God does not provide miraculous healing, God has not abandoned those with mental illness. God's presence can be experienced through resources such as psychotherapists, good friends, a good psychiatrist or therapist, and effective medication. Another assertion is that an abundant life is not necessarily a life without illness, disease, or physical disability. An abundant life is a life in which people are able to attain a sense of well-being and are in right and good relationship with God, with other people, with the environment, and with all of God's creation. Another assertion, people suffering with mental illness can bring their anger and frustration to God. God will hear their concerns and remain with them and not judge them for their feelings or their emotions. Another assertion, the value and importance of empathy for God, for the people of God will enable people not suffering from mental illness to identify with those who do. We need to empathize with others. Also, since mental illnesses are caused by genetic, environmental, and social factors, the presence of mental illness is not an indication of sin. We also need to keep in mind that perfection is no longer a body or mind without blemish. So some people have thought this. Instead, perfection includes impairment from the experiences of injustice and persecution, or other life circumstances that people encounter. The bodies and minds of people with disabilities participate also in the Imago Dei through their disabilities, rather in spite of them. Thus, a new model of wholeness and health emerges in which disability is no longer exists in opposition to divine integrity. And I just want to say that again. So very often we've thought about the Imago Dei, or those who reflect the image of God, as being people who have physical, mental perfection. In reality, there is no such thing as physical or mental perfection. But by acknowledging the need for empathy and acceptance of those with mental health, we can broaden our image of what it's like, who actually reflects the image of God. And that should be all of God's people in all of our many manifestations. Just a few cautions for people who are preachers as they preach about mental health. And then I will kind of wind this up. The lived experiences of people with disabilities should not be used to interpret biblical texts when preaching on issues of, so it should be, I'm sorry, I said should not, should be used when preaching on issues of mental health and mental illnesses. So using experiences of those who actually have mental illnesses can be very helpful in helping your congregation have empathy for people with mental illness. Preachers should never assert that people engaged in some sort of behavior which led to their mental illness. Mental illnesses are caused by genetic, environmental, and societal factors. People should avoid offering group counseling sessions from the pulpit. While preachers certainly highlight issues and concerns about the ways congregants relate to one another, psychological analysis is best left to mental health professionals. As with all sermons, preachers should never use the lived experiences of people within their congregations in their sermons without permission. Just to be clear. Nobody should be surprised on a Sunday morning to hear the preacher tell their story about their mental health struggles when they did not give permission for that to occur. The stigmatization of people with mental illness makes this practice especially relevant for stories involving the lived experiences of mental illness. And as with all sermons, preachers should not employ the accusatory you language when highlighting what the congregation should and should not do. You language asserts that the preacher has no room for growth or improvement on the subject, unlike all of the regular people in the pews. Instead, the preacher should use we language to indicate that everyone, including the preacher, needs to follow the advice and guidance being shared in the sermons. Every week, the people of God gather to hear the good news of the gospel. Many of those gathering need to hear some good news about issues related to mental health and mental illness. Good news for people with mental illness would be that they and or their family members are not forgotten. Good news would be that God loves them unconditionally. Good news would be that there is a place for their loved ones, for them and their loved ones in the community of faith. Good news would be that they are part of a community that seeks to understand and support them in their struggles. And most importantly, people with mental health concerns need hope. Let's keep that in mind. Hope that their tomorrows can be better than their today, that they can be fully accepted as the children of God they are. When preachers regularly incorporate sermons about mental health into the preaching program, the entire faith community will learn to acknowledge and embrace their siblings in Christ who happen to have mental illnesses. The mental health hermeneutic or approaches to preaching developed in this lecture will hopefully, my hope is that it provides some guidelines for preachers seeking to develop sermons with people with mental illnesses in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Debra. Thank you for your substantial and compelling presentation. It's very thought-provoking. Your call to church to remove the stigma of mental illness and to integrate mental health perspective into our preaching is not only essential, but also timely in this post-COVID era. As we reflect on your insights, it's clear that churches must become welcoming spaces where people can freely talk about and explore the importance of mental well-being in relation to their spiritual lives. So let me have some response to your lecture. So you start the discussion by noting that despite how common mental illness is today, there's still a strong stigma associated with it. When you declared mental health as a basic human right, I think it struck a powerful chord. This declaration acts as a counter-narrative to the persistent stigma and stereotypes attached to mental illness across many cultures. It challenges the dismissive attitudes that often push mental health to the peripheries of public and private spheres. It also resists against the societal tendency to overlook or undervalue mental health issues, dismantling the normative biases that assume certain form of ability is the norm. It reminds us that individuals affected by mental health issues are no less human. They deserve to be heard, acknowledged, and supported. We must do more than simply stop treating them as afterthoughts. We should also recognize their agency as individuals who can teach us and contribute to our community's flourishing. I think such acknowledgement also aligns well with theologian Amos Young's suggestion to shift our language from the disabled to persons with disabilities. This emphasis that we are all people first, and our abilities or disabilities are just one aspect of who we are. By proclaiming that mental health is a universal right, you have laid a profound ethical foundation for the Church's involvement in mental health advocacy. Specifically, you ask us to recognize providing mental health support not just as an act of compassion, but also an act of justice. As you explored the genetic, environmental, and social factors contributing to mental health issues with up-to-date statistics and research findings, you have shed light on the complex nature of mental health. And this has especially provided an important reading of the Bible that rejects a harmful interpretation that simply equates mental illness as signs of sin or divine curse. The environmental and social factors that contribute to mental health is especially revealing during the COVID-19 pandemic, like a global stress test. It exposed and worsened the cracks in our societal structures, leaving the most marginalized and vulnerable at greater risk. Therefore, Your lecture has effectively demonstrated the role of intersectionality in this context, where multiple systemic issues such as racism, classism, capitalism, and colonialism intersect to deepen the stigma around mental illness. These interlocking systems of power and oppression do not operate in solo. Instead, they compound and complicate the experiences of people with mental health issues, making their struggles not only medical, but also social, political, and economic battles. And the church's role in navigating these complex, intersecting systemic issues is crucial. Historically, the church has been a place of refuge and support, yet there exists a significant gap in understanding and addressing mental health proactively. As you note, widespread misunderstanding and fear about mental health often discourage people from seeking help, which reinforce stigma both within and outside church walls. A vital challenge for preachers, I think, is to deepen our understanding of the notion of intersectionality, recognize how complex hierarchical relations affect our preaching, and connect this to revealing hidden stories of mental health from the Bible and lived experiences. This involves interpreting biblical narratives in ways that resonate with contemporary understandings of mental health, and sharing these insights from the pulpit to foster a more inclusive and supportive community. Debra, I think you have shown that how preaching with the insights from theology of disability can support individuals with mental health challenges, as well as enriching the connective wisdom and mission of the church. I appreciate that your approach is embodying the foundational Christian principles of love and justice, and is challenging our congregational practices to be more reflective, inclusive, and compassionate. So when you discussed the works of Nancy Eastland, John Swinton, and Kathy Black to draw theological assertions and provide preaching guidance, I really like your statement about perfection, how you illustrate what it means for perfect in our culture. You said, perfection is no longer a body or mind without blemish. Instead, perfection includes impairments from experiences of injustice and persecution. This perspective is incredibly powerful, as it brings down the twisted idea of perfection in our culture, which is fundamentally idolatrous in nature. And I think that your field is deeply Christocentric. You invite us to see the beauty and wholeness of humanity through a human experience shared by Jesus Christ, marked by struggle and pain. Just as the lectionary gospel readings in the Easter season tells us, the Bible shows that Jesus' incarnated body experienced injustice and persecution. Even in his risen body, the wounds remained. And this body of Jesus reveals a profound truth. Full humanity is not about being flawless. Instead, by embracing our imperfections and pain, we are participating in the body of the crucified God, in whom we found real wholeness. This understanding, I think, is closely related to our theology about God's ultimate salvific plan for humanity. And it also inspires to think what it means to be fully human. Now, your presentation has left me with some questions to think about. So first, how can our sermons better capture the complex reality of mental health issue and disability, covering not just the physical aspect or mental aspect, but yes, spiritually, but its social, economic, and spiritual dimensions as well? Given that mental health issues are intertwined with systemic problems, how can preaching address this issue in a more structural way? And regarding the use of language, you suggest a shift from you to we language to indicate that everyone, both the preacher and listeners, is part of the community and subject to the advice and guidance shared in the sermon. Beyond that, I'm curious about what other language and terminology changes are necessary to sensitively preach from a disability hermeneutic. Also, are there specific analogies or illustrations we could use in sermons to discuss mental health and disabilities in a way that avoid stigmatizing them? And lastly, what resources would you recommend for educating ourselves and our congregations about mental health from medical, psychological, and spiritual perspectives? Thank you again, Debra, for such a thought-provoking lecture. So would you like to add a few words before we open up the floor for questions, or shall we go straight
No, I want to thank you for
to
your
a dialogue with the audience? What do you
sure.
think?
Oh, yeah. I want to thank you for your response. And I do have some resources that I can send you, that I can share with others, that can be read. Some are books, some are articles that I think can be helpful as we all endeavor to do much better about incorporating mental health into our work. So I can certainly share those with you. And
It will be
thank you.
very helpful. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you want to open up the floor for
Absolutely.
questions?
Absolutely.
Please, folks. Yeah.
Yeah,
Sean.
I was just going to say, I encourage you, if you have a question, to just click on the reactions button at the bottom of your screen and click on raise hand, and and then we can get to your question. Or if you don't want to ask through the video, you can type in your question through the chat. All right, we have a question from Steve. Oh, okay. So Steve's in the library, so he can't ask this question out loud. But he says, I was wondering if you think it's still helpful to maintain a mental physical dichotomy. Can we frame mental health as physical health? The brain is part of the body, etc.
Oh, that's an excellent question. It'd probably be more helpful just to talk about health in general, and make that very holistic. And I know that we often separate the physical health from mental health, but examples like the Simone Biles example, for instance. She said she wasn't in a good mental space and could have injured herself physically. So it just tells us that everything that we do is like there's an intersectionality within ourselves, and larger intersectionalities as well. So it probably would be more accurate and easier for us to just talk about health and all of the many different ways that can be impacted by societal structures and circumstances. So I like that question.
Yeah, there's another question from Ian. Ian, do you want us to read it for you, or do you want to say it by yourself? Either way would be fine.
If you could read it, that would be great.
Yeah, so so Ian asked, how do we also avoid triggering people or showing sensitivity when doing preaching on mental health?
And I think part of it is just even up front as we are preaching, just to kind of give people an idea of where we're going. with the sermon so that so people aren't necessarily taken off guard. And we want to incorporate examples that are empowering for people, even though they may show ways people have been discriminated and some of the causes. We ultimately want to be supportive. And so I think by at least giving people, a clue before we embark on preaching about it or teaching about mental health, that will help them prepare themselves mentally for what is coming.
Wonderful. So, Deb Walker, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm very aware that the preacher, all of us are involved in these statistics,
Yes, we are.
and colleagues on stress leave, experiences of mental health within our families. A number of years, and it was years after the event, but I had a panic attack on an airplane. And later I described it as, because it was a positive outcome and I was safe and everything else. But I did describe this moment. And afterwards, I think I had more comments and reactions to sharing that particular story from my own experience than almost any other illustration in sermon writing. And so how do you navigate that very vulnerable sharing of our own mental health without then having the congregation fearing for our well-being?
That's always the case. So we know that personal testimony and preaching can be a really good thing because it lets people know that preachers are human, and that we share in the same struggles as everybody else. But then at the same time, there are some precautions that should be taken in sharing our stories. One is that we don't want to tell our personal stories too soon, right? Because sometimes if we tell something that happened to us and we're still haven't completely processed it, then we may do the opposite of helping people in our sermon. The focus of the sermon then becomes us and people caring for us, and we don't want it to be about us. It should be about larger issues, a larger community. And so we shouldn't share those stories too soon. And we should also always, when we sharing our personal stories, even though it is personal, also point it to God and what God has done for us in this whole process. So it's the focus is not on the preacher because people feel sorry for us, and then we get off track a little bit. So we should make sure that even though we use ourselves as a personal illustration in a timely way, that we also point people ultimately to what God has done through us, with us, and that God can do the same thing through them in their lives. And I think that can be helpful. Yeah. There's probably more there too, but that's a couple of things.
Very good. Yeah. So Aisha has a question. So what are some of the scriptures you use to preach about mental health and wellness?
Yeah, so I kind of point to a few of those, like Kathleen Black has used some of those texts, like the some known as the Gerasene demoniac. We can also talk about some of the other texts. There's a text called with the Syrophoenician woman, and she pushes back on God. people don't really think about that as a mental health issue, but to me, she is taking care of herself and her child, and helping her to create a good mental health moment. So I think there are other texts in the Bible where we don't necessarily identify them with mental health, where somebody actually maybe stands up for other people or pushes back against powers and principalities, that can also be preached from a mental health perspective, because they are standing up and not creating situations and the circumstances where people will have mental health concerns arise. So and some of the resources that I'll send to Wing Yi, I'll also share some of the other texts that can be helpful.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think we all want to read that for sure. Yeah. So, Sorin Kim, yeah, please.
Debra, I really thank for your insight for preacher to take care of those who are suffering out of mental illnesses. You have indicated 3 root of causes of the mental illnesses, which are generic and environmental and social. And I acknowledge the preacher's role to take care of those who are suffering with mental illnesses. But at the same time, how could we work with those roots of causes, preventing those mental illnesses as preachers, instead of healing those illnesses after having very serious symptoms? How could we prevent those 3 roots of causes of the mental illnesses?
So there's probably, I don't know about some of the genetic factors. Some of that may be very difficult, but sometimes people have, but again, when we talk about genetic, socioeconomic and environmental, when we kind of think about that, some of those issues are at their root caused by injustice. When we think about some of the many factors that I kind of talked about, racial discrimination, there's a practice of not having some communities have as many resources as others, having some kids go through schools and don't have the opportunities that others have. So some of these causes are justice issues. And so for preachers to get involved in their communities and issues of justice, wherever they may be found, can lend to the good mental health of people in those communities. Sometimes there are environmental factors. I know there's some neighborhoods in Louisville, Kentucky, where I am, where there is maybe toxic waste being dumped in some neighborhoods, and people have been fighting that for a long time. That contributes to physical health, mental health, overall health issues, and it's a justice issue. And it's something that we can all get involved in. So I think when we involve ourselves in issues of justice, we shouldn't think about it as something separate from overall health and contributing to mental health in particular.
Thank you. Yeah. Helen, please.
Thank you so much, Debra and Wingy, for your words. It was super helpful. I'm just wondering how, in practical ways, how the justice work for mentally ill people suffering from mental illness, how we might enact it in real life. Because right now I understand that the reading the scripture changes our view of God and the image of God that's there. but it changes our way of thinking about mental illness. But then how do we put that into action for justice, for mentally ill, for all of us?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. And I think some of it may come from working with people already doing work with people suffering with mental illness and having conversations with them to see what kinds of support people with mental illness needs and how our particular communities might be able to lend that support. I truly believe that we should never go into any particular situation, if it's a justice issue, and think that we have all of the answers and that we kind of bring solutions. I think solutions come through conversations with people. And if we are in conversation with people and agencies that are already doing some of this work, they may be able to tell us how we can help. Because it's not the same in every neighborhood, it's not the same in every society, how people might be helped. So I think just having the conversations can be helpful. And I think when we preach, we may find that some people who have been kind of silent about their mental health struggles may come to us and they may be in a one-on-one and share their stories. And at that point, we can ask them, what kind and what way can we support you? How can we as a community of faith, your community of faith, help you? And hopefully they'll tell us. And that may sound old fashioned, but if we have conversations, people may let us know exactly what they need.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Yes, Kenneth, please.
Ken, can you unmute yourself? If you want, you can turn on your video as well. That'd be great.
So I've been thinking, is that okay?
That's
Yes,
great.
yes, please.
Okay, great. Thank you. So recently I've been thinking about that despite reducing our level of taboo societally, it's difficult for those of us who are challenged to look past our own disability. Our lived experience is difficult to move past. And I think we just need to be aware of the fact that we have talents, we have lived experience, and I think we need, perhaps in the company of others, to spend time thinking about that, and of course always sharing, given the limitations you've already laid out.
Mhm.
I wonder if you have some insights.
Yeah, and do you mean, Kenneth, like just the self-stigma that some people struggling with mental illness just have? And some of this is a result of maybe being I don't know, oppressed, marginalized, not taken seriously. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons that people have self-stigma when it comes to it. Some may start inside families and communities and in church and in other places. And all of that is really can be very, very challenging. And so one of the reasons I wanted to kind of just raise this issue is because in many ways, the internalization of the stigma can be so debilitating that even if we have outside support, if we're not able to shift our own perception of ourselves, and then we don't make as much progress as we might otherwise make. So some of that, I think if we have access or the ability to have therapy, so we can kind of work through some of those issues, I think that is really important. I'm an advocate of mental health therapy. I'm dean of a school where we have a marriage and family therapy program. This is one of the reasons I'm probably as such an advocate, but I think that's part of it. And my hope is that for those who have internalized some of this stigma, that by having a faith community that is really embracing and supportive, that may help. But I know it takes a while, even with the self-stigma, to admit or to share your experiences with other people.
Mm,
Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
yeah. So, Reverend Tony Snow, please.
Hello, thank you. I'm a Indigenous minister with the Chinook Winds region in southern Alberta. I'm very happy to share in this time and hear this. I think it's an important presentation, especially around mental health for many of our Indigenous people, where we deal with ongoing issues around suicide and addictions and many other facets of the mental health crisis that has been ongoing for a number of years. A lot of times we are dealing with collective trauma based on shared common experiences of the reservation system, of being in urban centers and being excluded from access to resources, especially around mental health. So there's a shared intergenerational history and intergenerational trauma that's associated with Indigenous communities, especially those that are outside the urban centers. So one of the things that I think is important is a lot of the remedies that we've seen from Western science has been to lift up a lot of the medical treatments and such for Indigenous people, where I think respect for Indigenous healing practices, Indigenous healing ways are necessary to understand, and that's part of I think a call for the church to really understand that we are different in our faith stories and our faith histories and how faiths have affected groups. So that's part of the trauma. So it's a difficult sort of approach to bridge that with the church itself and Christianity being one of the perpetrators of many of the harms. So turning around and trying to find a balance between how we can offer healing. I think there's some redress that needs to happen between that faith perspective into what a healing and reconciling vision would be that will help promote better outcomes for mental health issues on reserve and in urban centers where Indigenous people are populating.
Absolutely. Reconciliation, that's huge. There have been immense harms, perpetrated upon First Nations people across the world, and by the church, and we can look historically about how many ways those atrocities have been perpetrated, and the toll that has taken on people in so many ways, mental health being one of those. That is extremely important. And that is not an easy fix. There has to be an admission of wrongdoing on the part of the church. There has to be, kind of talks about how can honest conversations about how this can actually be addressed. And in those conversations, the perpetrators should do the listening, so that they may know how best to proceed. I thank you for raising that, and it's a lot of work that needs to be done to kind of even have that be addressed in some meaningful way. So thank you so much for raising it. And it is definitely a larger issue that will take much time to be addressed.
Yeah. So I think it will be the last question from Ian. So do you also feel mental health informed preaching as prophetic?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely prophetic. In the sense of prophetic preaching, actually addressing relevant issues to our contemporary context, but then also tying in who God is and what God is doing in the world. So absolutely prophetic.
Yeah. So as we conclude this session, I'd like to thank once again for Debra, your profound contributions today. And let's give a round of applause to our wonderful speaker. And thank all of you for your engaging questions and the rich conversation that followed. As a testimony, I preached on the topic of disability at church yesterday, inspired by your lecture. So I believe this reflects the success and impact of your presentation. So may we all be inspired to bring healing and hope to all those we serve in body, mind, and spirit, our whole self. So thank you. So I wish pass the time to Sean to share a few words.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Reverend Dr. Debra Mumford, on behalf of the Center for Religion and its Context at Emmanuel College and Shining Waters Regional Council with the United Church of Canada for your extraordinary talk today. I am not a preacher, full disclosure, but I benefited greatly from your talk today. Your call for interdependence, and also it really struck me about your mentioning or your framework around how perfection includes impairment and blemishes, and I really do appreciate that as a layperson. So thank you so much for today's talk. I'm grateful for this. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Wingy, for your extraordinary, competent facilitation today and your response. Deeply